she never expected a man like him to walk through her door. She never expected any of this. The black cars lining the street outside her family's crumbling home, the silence that fell over the neighborhood like a held breath, the way her uncle's hands trembled when he opened the door. She had been in the kitchen that morning, flour dusted across her forearms, trying to stretch enough bread dough to feed 4 people on what was left in the pantry. That was Sofia Moretti's world, small, quiet, held together with scraped-together savings and the stubborn refusal to give up. She had no idea that world was about to be torn apart. She heard his voice before she saw him, deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once been told no and had no frame of reference for what that word even sounded like. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped toward the hallway, and that was the moment she saw him standing in the entrance of her home like he owned it, which, as she would soon learn, he essentially did. Dante Cavalieri. Even his name, she would later think, sounded like a sentence handed down by a judge who had already decided your fate. He was tall in the way that powerful men are tall, not just in height, but in the space he occupied, the air he displaced simply by being present. Dark suit, immaculately pressed. Dark eyes that moved across the room with the calm, methodical assessment of a man cataloging everything he sees as either useful or expendable. He had a scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, thin, pale, barely visible unless the light hit it a certain way. And something about that scar made him more frightening, not less. It was proof that he had survived something that should have ended him. It was a reminder that the world had tried to break him and failed. He turned those eyes on Sofia. She felt it like a physical thing, that gaze. It pinned her to the floor of her own hallway. He said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he is considering acquiring. Then he turned back to her uncle, Marco, who was standing with his shoulders folded inward and his eyes cast downward, and Dante Cavalieri said in that same unhurried voice, "She'll do." Sofia had no idea what those words meant yet. By nightfall, she would understand everything. To understand how Sofia Moretti ended up standing in the living room of her family's modest house while one of the most dangerous men in the city casually decided her future, you have to understand what kind of life she had been living, and more importantly, what kind of family she had been born into, even if she had never truly known it. Sofia was 24 years old. She had grown up believing she was the daughter of a man named Enzo Moretti, her father, who had died in a car accident when she was 7 years old, and a mother named Elena, who had followed him into the grave only 2 years later from a grief that manifested as illness and then simply as absence. After that, Sofia had been raised by her uncle Marco, her father's younger brother, in the same narrow house in the older part of the city where the streets were cobblestoned and the buildings leaned slightly toward each other as if sharing secrets. She had been a good student, a diligent, careful, quietly intelligent young woman who had spent 4 years studying literature at the university on a scholarship she had earned entirely through her own effort. She had a best friend named Caterina, who was loud and bold in all the ways Sofia was not. She had a small garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes and herbs. She read voraciously, she cooked beautifully, she asked for very little and gave more than she should. She knew, in the vague, peripheral way that children absorb things without being told, that her uncle Marco was involved in business that existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. There were men who came to visit him at odd hours. There were conversations that stopped when she entered a room. There were envelopes passed across tables and phone calls made in hushed voices behind closed doors. But Marco had always been careful to keep that world away from Sofia, and she had been careful in her own way not to ask too many questions. She had no idea how deep that world went. She had no idea that her family name, Moretti, was not simply a surname, but a title, a legacy, a crown that had been hidden away in a drawer and never spoken of. She had no idea that her grandfather, the man she had only the faintest memory of as a stern-faced old man who smelled of cedar and cigars,
had been one of the most formidable crime lords this city had ever produced, that the Moretti family had once controlled half the eastern territories, that the name commanded respect in rooms Sofia had never been allowed to enter. And she had absolutely no idea that when her grandfather died 12 years ago, he had left behind a will, a secret will, known only to his most trusted attorney, that named not Marco, not any of the uncles or cousins who had squabbled over the empire, but Sofia herself as the sole legitimate heir to everything the Moretti family had built. Sofia knew none of this.
She only knew that her uncle Marco owed a debt to Dante Cavalieri, a debt so enormous, so catastrophically beyond anything that could be repaid in money or favors, that it had brought the most feared man in the city to their front door on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. And she only knew that Marco, trembling and gray-faced, had agreed to Dante's terms before Sofia even understood what was being negotiated. She was to marry Dante Cavalieri in 30 days. The first time Sofia truly looked at Dante, really looked past the shock and the fear and the disbelief, was in the back of his car that same evening when he had insisted on driving her to dinner to discuss, as he coldly put it, the arrangements. His driver sat behind the partition of darkened glass. Dante sat beside her, not touching her, not speaking to her, reading documents on his phone with the complete indifference of a man who had already moved on to his next obligation. Sofia stared at her own hands in her lap and tried to remember how to breathe. "You can't actually make me do this," she said finally. Her voice was steadier than she expected. That surprised even her. Dante didn't look up from his phone. "I'm not making you do anything," he said. "I'm offering your family a solution to a problem that will otherwise result in consequences none of you will enjoy." "That's what making someone do something looks like," Sofia said. Now he looked up. Those dark eyes settled on her face with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second so brief she almost missed it, something shifted behind them. Not warmth exactly, more like curiosity, the way a chess player looks at an opponent who has made an unexpected move. "You're more direct than I expected," he said. "I'm a person," Sofia said, "not a solution." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something cooler than that. "You are, in fact, both right now." Sofia turned away from him and looked out the window at the city moving past, the lights, the people going about their ordinary lives, and she felt something cold settle into the space beneath her ribs. Not just fear, something harder than fear, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. She didn't know yet that this resolve was not something she had developed on her own. It was something inherited. It was something that ran in her blood from people she had never truly known. She just didn't know it yet. Dante Cavalieri had not always been the man who sat in the back of armored cars and received the kind of deference that made grown men fold in on themselves. He had not always been the head of the Cavalieri family, the organization that controlled the Western territories, the port operations, the financial networks that moved money through half the legitimate businesses in the city, without anyone being the wiser. He had been born into that world, yes, but he had been born as the second son, the unexpected one, the one nobody had groomed for power or prepared for leadership. His older brother Nico had been the heir apparent, charming, brilliant, beloved. Nico had been the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel chosen. Dante had been the quiet one, the one who watched, the one who calculated. And then, when Dante was 26 years old, Nico was killed, shot twice in the chest in a parking structure outside a restaurant on a Wednesday evening, in what was immediately understood to be a message from a rival family. The investigation went nowhere. The men responsible were never publicly named, and Dante, who had watched his brother's blood pool across gray concrete while he held him and told him to stay awake, to keep breathing,
to not you dare close his eyes. Dante had changed that night in ways that could not be undone. He had taken over the family. He had found the men responsible one by one over the following 2 years. He had dealt with them in ways that were never discussed openly, but were understood entirely. And he had built the Cavalieri organization into something so formidable, so precisely constructed, so deeply embedded in every layer of the city's power structure, that no one had challenged it in the 5 years since. He was 32 years old. He was feared. He was respected. He was alone in a way that he had long since decided was not a weakness, but a condition of the life he had chosen. He didn't need a wife. He was acquiring it because it served a strategic purpose. The Moretti family's debt to him was not about money. It was about territory, about a piece of the Eastern Corridor that Marco Moretti had promised to a third party against Dante's explicit agreement, destabilizing a carefully negotiated balance that had taken years to construct. The debt was political. The solution needed to be political. A marriage between the Cavalieri name and the Moretti name would consolidate the Eastern and Western territories under one roof. It would end the vulnerability. It would send a message to every family watching from the periphery. That was all this was. That was what Dante told himself. He told himself this with particular conviction on the evening of that first dinner, when Sofia Moretti, in a simple navy dress, with her dark hair pulled back and her chin lifted with a dignity that shouldn't have been possible given the circumstances, said to him across a candle-lit table in the most expensive restaurant in the city, "I want to negotiate." He set down his wine glass. "Excuse me?" "If I agree to this marriage," she said, calmly, as if they were discussing something entirely unremarkable, "I want conditions for my family's protection, for my own, written, signed, witnessed." Dante stared at her for a long moment. "You don't have leverage to negotiate," he said. "You need this marriage to be legal and convincing. That requires my willing cooperation. I'd call that leverage." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become something else entirely, something charged and alive and completely unexpected. Then Dante said quietly, "What are your conditions?" The 30 days before the wedding were the strangest of Sofia's life. Dante had agreed to her conditions, a formal, witnessed agreement that stipulated the protection of her Uncle Marco from any further claims or retaliation, the financial stability of her family home, and Sofia's own right to continue her studies and maintain a degree of personal freedom within the marriage. He had agreed without argument, which itself told her something about how much he needed this arrangement. She filed that information away carefully. She moved into Dante's estate 2 weeks before the wedding, per his insistence, a formality, he said, of appearance. The estate was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. It sat behind iron gates on the elevated edge of the city, a sprawling white stone building surrounded by cypress trees and formal gardens, and it was the kind of place that announced, without subtlety, that the man who lived there was accustomed to a particular level of power. Inside, it was immaculate and cold, in the way that spaces are cold when no one has ever truly made them a home. Beautiful, expensive furniture, art on the walls that was chosen for investment rather than love, rooms that were perfectly maintained and completely unlived in. Sofia was given her own suite of rooms on the second floor. She was given a wardrobe that appeared overnight, full of clothes in her size that she hadn't asked for and couldn't imagine choosing. She was given the use of a car and a driver, and told that she could go where she wished within reason, which she understood to mean within monitoring, which she accepted with the calm practicality she was beginning to recognize as her own particular form of survival. She didn't see Dante often during those 2 weeks. He was away, occupied, running an empire that never slept. But she saw evidence of him everywhere in that house. The precise order of every room, the books on the shelves, military history, philosophy, economics that were broken-spined and annotated because apparently Dante Cavalieri actually read the books he owned, which surprised her more than it should have. The photograph on his desk in the study, the only photograph anywhere in the house, of a young man laughing, caught mid-sentence, radiantly alive. The brother, she understood, immediately. Nico. She stood in that study for a long time, looking at that photograph. She was beginning to understand that the man she was being forced to marry was more complicated than she had initially assessed. She wasn't sure if that made this better or worse. The night before the wedding, Sophia couldn't sleep. She sat on the window seat in her room with her knees drawn up to her chest and watched the gardens below, silver-lit by moonlight, and she thought about her mother and her father and the life she had planned that was being dismantled around her with a speed and inevitability she still couldn't fully process. She was startled by a sound in the hallway, footsteps, unhurried and deliberate, slowing outside her door, then silence, then, after a moment, a quiet knock. She opened the door. Dante stood there in dark trousers and a white shirt with the collar open, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like something other than a controlled, immovable force of nature. He looked like a man who also couldn't sleep. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and something in the set of his jaw that she was beginning to recognize as the specific tension he carried when he was thinking about something he wouldn't speak aloud. He held a glass of red wine. He looked at her for a moment. "I saw your light," he said. "You were watching my light?" she asked. "I was walking," he said. A pause. "Do you want the wine or not?" he asked. She took it. She didn't drink it immediately. She just held it. "Are you afraid?" he asked, not cruelly, almost carefully. "Wouldn't you be?" she said. "I would be," he said. And the honesty of that, the simple, quiet honesty of it from a man she had categorized as incapable of simple honesty, stopped her completely. They stood in the doorway of her room, not quite together, not quite apart. For a handful of minutes they spoke, about nothing significant, about the gardens, about a book she had seen on his shelf that she had read years ago, about the city stretched out below the hill, glittering in the dark. It was the first time she had experienced him as a human being rather than a force. She would think about that conversation for weeks afterward. She would think about the way he said goodnight, not warmly, not coldly, just honestly, like a man who was carefully choosing each word because carelessness was a luxury he had never been able to afford. She would think about the way he paused before turning away, as though he was considering saying something else and then deciding against it. She didn't know what he had decided not to say. She didn't know that standing in that hallway, Dante Cavalieri was having a thought he had absolutely no framework for. The thought that this woman, this infuriating, composed, negotiating woman, with flour on her apron and dignity in her spine, was the first person in 5 years who had made him feel something in the vicinity of unsettled. Not fear. Dante didn't do fear anymore. Something older than fear. Something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of caring. They were married on a Saturday. The ceremony was private, immediate family only, which on Dante's side meant 15 people whose presence alone communicated an entire structure of hierarchy and obligation, and on Sophia's side meant Uncle Marco, who cried, and her friend Caterina, who spent the entire ceremony visibly outraged on her behalf, while also, Sophia noticed, being extremely flustered by the presence of Dante's second-in-command, a man named Luca Ferrara, who was dangerously handsome and entirely aware of it. Sophia wore white, not because she chose it symbolically, but because the dress that arrived the morning of the wedding was white and perfectly fitted and so exquisitely beautiful that she had stood in front of the mirror for 10 full minutes, simply staring at it before she could bring herself to put it on. She was walked down the aisle alone. There was no one to give her away, a detail that pierced her quietly, privately, in the way that small absences can wound more sharply than great ones. Dante was waiting at the front of the room. He watched her walk toward him with that same steady, assessing gaze, and when she reached him and their eyes met,
Something passed between them that she couldn't name. Acknowledgement, perhaps. Recognition. The awareness of two people who were about to irrevocably change each other's lives. The vows were traditional. They repeated them like the words of a language neither of them had been taught to speak. When Dante slid the ring onto her finger, a diamond, simple and perfect, clearly chosen with care she hadn't expected, his hands were steady, and his eyes didn't leave her face, and Sophia found that she couldn't look away either. The officiant pronounced them married. Dante leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, formal, brief, appropriate to the performance of the thing. And yet the warmth of it, the simple human warmth of his skin against hers, hit Sophia somewhere unexpected and deep. She was married to Dante Cavalieri, and the world, which had always felt small and certain and manageable, had just become something else entirely. Life inside the estate settled into a rhythm over the following weeks that Sophia hadn't anticipated. Not easy, not comfortable in the traditional sense, but structured, real. Dante was present more than she had expected. He worked from home several days a week, often visible through the open door of his study, and they developed a silent, negotiated coexistence that was careful and watchful on both sides. He didn't touch her. He had been explicit about this. Their arrangement was a marriage of strategy, not intimacy, and he was a man who kept the terms of agreements. But he was present, and presence, Sophia was learning, was its own form of intimacy, whether you intended it or not. They ate dinner together most evenings. This had not been discussed or decided. It simply began to happen the way things do when two people share a space, and the absence of the other at a table becomes more conspicuous than their presence. At first, the dinners were almost entirely silent. Then they became conversational, cautiously, carefully, one topic at a time, like two people negotiating the terms of something they didn't yet have a name for. Dante asked her about her studies. She was still finishing her degree, still attending lectures 3 days a week as her conditions had guaranteed, and she talked about her thesis, a study of 19th century Italian literature, the way stories carried secret histories inside them, and he listened with the kind of genuine attention that she had not been prepared to find in him. In return, she asked him questions that she suspected no one usually dared to ask, about the city, about the businesses he ran that existed in the light and the businesses that existed in the shadow, about the photograph on his desk. The photograph on his desk was the question she asked most carefully on an evening when the light was low and warm, and he had poured them both the good scotch he kept for no particular occasion. "Tell me about him," she said. Dante was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "His name was Nico. He was the better man. That was the one fact that never stopped being true." Sophia said nothing, because some things don't need a response. She simply sat with him in the silence that followed and let the weight of it exist without trying to diminish it. Later that night, in her room, she thought about grief and how it changes people, how it can harden them into something impenetrable or hollow them out, or, and this was what she was beginning to suspect of Dante, how it can live inside a person like a second heartbeat, permanent and unremarked, shaping every movement without ever being named. She was beginning to understand him, and that was dangerous. She was beginning to suspect that understanding him might be the most dangerous thing she had done yet. 3 months into the marriage, the world cracked open. It began with a letter. It arrived on a Thursday morning, addressed to Sophia personally, not to Mrs. Cavalieri, not to the estate, but to Sophia Moretti Cavalieri, as if the sender knew exactly who she was beneath the name she had just acquired. The return address was a law firm she didn't recognize. She almost threw it away unopened, assuming it was some formality related to the marriage. Something stopped her. She opened it alone, in her room, with the morning light coming through the tall windows and the city humming quietly below.
The letter was from an attorney named Gianni Russo, who identified himself as the estate attorney of the late Alfredo Moretti, her grandfather. It informed her, in language that was precise and entirely unambiguous, that a will existed, that this will had been sealed, per her grandfather's explicit instruction, until Sophia reached the age of 24 and had been married, both conditions now being met, and that under the terms of this will, Sofia Valentina Moretti was the sole and complete heir of the Moretti estate, the Moretti holdings, and the Moretti legacy in its entirety. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and stopped breathing for what felt like a very long time. The Moretti Empire, the Eastern Territories, the networks her Uncle Marco had been managing, or rather mismanaging, for 12 years in the absence of a legitimate heir, the organization that her grandfather had built and then deliberately hidden from his own family in order to protect the one person he decided deserved it, her. The grandfather she barely remembered, the stern old man who had held her hand at her father's funeral and said nothing, just held her hand for an hour without letting go, had spent the last year of his life constructing a legal document that would, at precisely the right moment, change everything about who she was. He knew what she would be capable of, even when she was 12 years old, and had no idea that capability was something she possessed. He knew, and he hid it, and he waited, and now the moment had arrived. Sophia stood up. She walked to her window. She looked out at the city, her city, though she was only now beginning to understand in how many ways that was literally true, and she felt something rise inside her that was older than she was, older than this life, older than this marriage.
It felt like inheritance. It felt like coming home to a house she had never been in, but recognized down to the bone. She thought about Marco, about the debt to Dante, about the marriage that had been arranged between the Cavalieri family and the Moretti family, with Sophia as the transaction. And she thought none of them knew. Dante hadn't known who he was marrying. Marco hadn't known what he was bartering with. None of them had known that the woman they had treated as a commodity in someone else's negotiation was actually the most powerful player at the table. The question was, what was she going to do with that? She went to the law office 2 days later, telling no one where she was going, taking her own car for the first time since the marriage. Gianni Russo was a small man in his late 60s, with sharp, steady eyes behind silver-framed glasses and the practiced calm of someone who had been holding this secret for years and had made peace with the weight of it. He rose when she entered. He shook her hand. He sat across the desk from her and placed a folder in front of her that was 3 inches thick. "Your grandfather was a careful man," he said. "He was a stranger to me," Sophia said. "He was a great many things you don't yet know," Gianni said. "He was also a man who understood, better than anyone, the difference between power given and power earned. He watched you for years, Miss Moretti, quietly, from a distance. He was satisfied with what he saw." "He could have told me," Sophia said, and she was surprised to find that her voice carried something very close to grief. "He was afraid," Gianni said, "not for himself, for you. He knew what claiming this inheritance would mean, what it would require. He wanted you to have the choice at a time when you were strong enough to make it." Sophia looked down at the folder. "Is the marriage valid?" she asked, "under the terms of the will?" "The will stipulates marriage before inheritance can be claimed," Gianni confirmed. "The marriage is valid. The inheritance is yours to claim whenever you are ready." "What does claiming it mean?" Gianni paused. "It means that the Moretti family, the Eastern operations, the territory, the networks, the financial holdings, all of it, answers to you. It means that your Uncle Marco, who has been operating as a placeholder,
without the authority to truly lead, will be formalized in his true position, a subordinate. It means that anyone who has been dealing with the Moretti name is dealing with you. A pause. Including the Cavalieri family, he said. Including Dante, the man who had forced this marriage, who had acquired Sophia as a political solution, in doing so, had accidentally married the head of the very family he had intended to absorb. Sophia sat with this for a long, silent moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting at the center of her mind since she opened that letter. Did he know? Gianni's expression shifted in a way that told her the answer before he spoke. Your Uncle Marco knew of the will, Gianni said carefully. He was aware of its existence, though not its complete terms. Sophia went very still. He knew, Sophia said. When he agreed to give me to Dante Cavalieri, when he used me to pay a debt, he knew that I was the heir. Gianni said nothing. He didn't need to. Sophia stood. She picked up the folder. She held it against her chest like something precious and breakable. I need time, she said. Of course, Gianni said. She walked out of the office into the afternoon light, and the city hummed around her, indifferent, busy, alive, and she felt the ground beneath her feet as if for the first time, as if she had only now, at this moment, genuinely arrived in her own life. Her uncle had known. He had known she was the heir to the Moretti Empire, and he had bartered her, knowingly, to pay his own debt, because with Sophia married to Dante, the inheritance would be complicated, contested, perhaps impossible to claim, because a woman married into the Cavalieri family and living inside its walls would have no capacity to lead a rival empire, because Marco had calculated that Sophia, kept in comfortable ignorance inside a gilded marriage, would never know what she had given up. He had used her, deliberately, with full knowledge. And Dante had used her too, but Dante hadn't known. Dante believed he was making a strategic marriage with the niece of a mid-level crime family with debts. He hadn't known that he was walking the heir of the Eastern Empire directly into his home, where her blood and her name and her rights would sit at his dinner table every evening. Which of them was the greater betrayal? She didn't know yet. She went to home, back to the estate, back to the house that was not yet home, but was beginning to feel like one in ways she couldn't afford to examine too carefully. And she sat in the parked car for a long, silent moment, staring through the windshield at the iron gates, thinking about trust and power and the particular brutality of being loved by people who are afraid of you. Her grandfather had loved her. She believed that. But love, it seemed, was not always honest. She told no one. Not yet. She kept the folder hidden. She returned Gianni Russo's calls. She began, quietly and carefully, to educate herself, meeting with him weekly under the pretense of library visits, learning the scope of what she had inherited, learning the structure of the Moretti operations, learning the names and the histories and the relationships that constituted an empire she had never been told was hers. She was a fast learner. Gianni said this with something approaching awe. She had her grandfather's mind, he told her, the ability to see a system whole, to identify its pressure points and its vulnerabilities without being told where to look. She had always thought her analytic mind was something she had built herself, through books and study and stubborn self-cultivation. She was beginning to understand that it had been waiting in her all along, that she had come to it on her own, yes, but it had also been waiting for her. During this time, the marriage continued. On the surface, nothing changed, and yet everything was changing, because Sophia was changing, and change of that magnitude cannot be entirely hidden from someone who watches as carefully as Dante watched. He noticed the new steadiness in her, the way she moved through rooms differently, not with the careful, contained dignity she had arrived with, but with something that had roots in it, something that came from the ground up. He noticed the way she looked at him sometimes across the dinner table with an expression he couldn't read, thoughtful and complicated and alive with something he couldn't name. He noticed, and he didn't ask, because Dante understood the value of waiting. But he was also, and this was the thing that surprised him most, worried about her. This was new. Dante Cavalieri had not worried about another person in 5 years, since Nico. He had deliberately, methodically dismantled the part of himself that was capable of that particular vulnerability, because he had learned what happened when you cared about someone in this life and then lost them. He had learned what that cost. He had decided it was a cost he would not pay again. And yet here was Sophia sitting across from him at dinner, silent and bright-eyed, and carrying something heavy in her expression, and Dante found himself waiting for her to speak, found himself in meeting after meeting, in call after call, in all the machinery of a very large and demanding criminal empire, thinking about whether she had eaten, whether she had slept, whether whatever she was working through alone in that beautiful, closed-off face of hers was something he could help carry. He did not examine this feeling. He especially did not examine the evening when he came home late and found her asleep on the library sofa with an open book on her chest and her dark hair loose around her face, and he stood in the doorway for several minutes, just watching her breathe, feeling something so enormous and unfamiliar in his chest that he physically put his hand against the doorframe to steady himself. He took a blanket from the chest near the window and laid it over her without waking her. Then he went upstairs and stood at his window looking out at the city and thought, with the controlled precision he applied to all things, "This is going to cost me everything." And for the first time in 5 years, that thought did not make him want to pull away. The crisis arrived, as crises in this world tend to arrive, without warning and from a direction no one was watching. It came in the form of a man named Vitale. Lorenzo Vitale was the head of the most aggressive of the rising crime families, young, reckless, brilliant in the way that dangerous people without patience are brilliant, and deeply invested in destabilizing the balance of power that Dante had spent years constructing. He had been watching the Moretti situation with interest. He had been watching the marriage with particular interest. And now, somehow, through whose mouth Sophia couldn't immediately determine, Vitale knew about the will. He knew about the inheritance. He knew that Sophia Moretti Cavalieri was the legitimate heir to the Eastern Empire, and he intended to use that information before she could. The message arrived on a Tuesday, not to Sophia, to Dante. A single paragraph routed through an intermediary that outlined coldly and concisely what Vitale knew and what he intended to do with it. He intended to approach the Moretti networks directly, bypassing both Dante and Sophia, claiming that the marriage was a manipulation, a forced arrangement that the legitimate heir had entered under duress, and therefore invalid under the terms of the will. He intended to position himself as a protector of Moretti interests. He intended to split the Eastern Territory away from the Cavalieri orbit before Sophia could claim it herself. And he had a deadline, 72 hours. Dante read this message at his desk in his study and felt the specific cold that settled into him when a situation required total, immediate control. He stood. He called Luca. He began to move. What he did not do, for reasons he would later not be able to fully explain to himself, was confront Sophia immediately. Instead, he went to find her. She was in the garden. She did that, went to the garden when she was thinking, in the way some people pace or talk to themselves. She was standing near the rose trellises with her hands at her sides and her face tilted slightly toward the late afternoon sky. And she looked, Dante thought, like a person who has just made a very large decision. She turned when she heard him approach. Their eyes met, and Sophia said before he could speak, "You got the message." Dante stopped. "You know," she said. "I've known for months." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were steady. "The will, the inheritance, everything." A pause. "I was going to tell you." "When?" The word came out sharper than he intended. "When I knew what I wanted to do with it. I needed to understand it first. I needed to understand myself first." She looked at him directly. "I know that sounds like a justification." "It does," she said. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I should have told you sooner. But Dante," she said his name, and something about hearing his name in her voice, not as a formality, not as a courtesy, but with weight in it, stopped him. "My Uncle Marco knew about the will when he arranged this marriage. He knew I was the heir, and he used me anyway. He gave me away to pay his debt, knowing that it would compromise my ability to claim what was mine." A pause. "I needed time to understand what that meant before I decided to do anything about it." The silence that followed was long and charged. Dante looked at her, really looked, with the same focused attention he had been giving her since the first morning she stood in that hallway with flour on her forearms, and he felt the full weight of it, the intelligence, the patience, the quiet, deliberate courage of a woman who had discovered she was the heir to an empire, and then spent 3 months secretly teaching herself how to lead it before she said a word to anyone. His grandfather would have liked her, he thought with sudden, unexpected clarity. No, more than that. She was exactly what the Moretti Empire had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. "Vitale has 72 hours, Dante said. "I know," she said. "Gianni warned me this morning." She met his eyes. "I'm ready to claim the inheritance, formally, today if possible." "If you claim it, the Moretti organization answers to you, not to me." "Yes," Sophia said. "I know." "That changes the nature of this marriage." "Does it?" she said. Another silence. This one different from the first. "We would be equals," Dante said. It wasn't quite a statement. It wasn't quite a question. Sophia looked at him steadily. "Were we not before?" And Dante, who had not smiled, genuinely smiled, not the cold, economical thing he deployed in boardrooms and negotiations, felt something move across his face that he recognized distantly as the beginning of one.
Sophia took a step toward him. Dante stayed entirely still, in the way that very controlled people stay still when something is happening that they have decided not to prevent. "I didn't want this marriage," she said. "You know that." "I know," he said. "I don't know when it stopped being something I was enduring," she said, "but it stopped." She looked at him. "I think you know that too." "I know," he said again, quieter. "Dante," his name again with that weight in it. He moved toward her, not quickly. Nothing Dante Cavalieri did was quick in the ways that mattered, but with absolute certainty, like a man who has been standing at the edge of a decision for months and has finally, irrevocably made it. His hand came up to her face, not grabbing, not demanding, just present, his palm against her cheek, with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything the world thought it knew about him. And he looked at her for one long, final moment of consideration. "Sophia," he said,
Yes, she said, before he could ask. And Dante Cavalieri, who had not let himself feel anything in 5 years, who had rebuilt himself out of grief and discipline and the cold comfort of power, who had arranged a marriage for strategic reasons and ended up walking directly into the center of something he had no strategy for, kissed his wife. Not as a performance, not as a formality, for the first time since he had met her, without any calculation at all. In the weeks and months that followed, Sofia Moretti Cavalieri did something that no one, not Vitale, not Marco, not the dozens of old men who ran the peripheral families and had opinions about who should and shouldn't lead, had expected a 24-year-old woman to do. She led. She led with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent her entire life observing without being observed, listening without being listened to, understanding systems from the outside before she was ever allowed inside them. She restructured the Moretti operations with a precision that made Johnny Russo shake his head in something approaching reverence. She navigated the political landscape of the Eastern Territories with the patience and strategic calm of someone twice her age. She made alliances. She resolved conflicts. She handled a territorial dispute between two mid-level families with a deftness that left both parties satisfied and slightly bewildered, and she did it without a single escalation to violence. Dante watched this with an expression that his second-in-command, Luca, no stranger to watching his boss be inscrutable, privately described as a man trying very hard not to look proud and failing entirely. The old men with opinions revised their opinions. The city, which had thought it knew everything about the Moretti Cavalieri marriage, discovered it knew nothing. There was one evening, perhaps 3 months after the night in the entrance hall, when Sofia found Dante in the study with the photograph of Nico. He was standing at his desk, not working, just holding the photograph in both hands, and his face had the open, unguarded look of a man alone with his grief who doesn't know he's being watched. She knocked softly on the open door. He looked up. "Tell me more about him," she said. "I want to know him." Dante set the photograph down. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved from behind the desk and sat on the sofa, and Sofia sat beside him, close but not touching, and he began to talk. He talked about Nico for a long time, about his laugh, about the way he could walk into any room and immediately identify the person most in need of being spoken to, about the arguments they had, the ridiculous ones and the important ones, about the morning of the funeral, when Dante had stood at the graveside and felt the specific cold of understanding that the world was going to continue turning whether he was all right or not. Sofia listened. She didn't try to fix any of it. She simply sat with him and let the love that was wrapped around the grief exist without being managed. At some point, she wasn't sure exactly when, his hand found hers on the cushion between them. He didn't look at her when he did it. He simply held her hand, tightly, in the way of a person who has been holding something too hard alone for too long. She held back. They sat like that in the study for a very long time, with the city humming beyond the windows, and the photograph of Nico on the desk, and the past and the present sitting side by side like old companions, until the night had softened into something that felt, unmistakably, like peace. The document arrived on a morning in early spring, a formal report from Johnny's office that outlined the full scope of the United Moretti Cavalieri holdings now that the inheritance had been formally integrated. Sofia read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and then she set it down and looked out at the garden where the first flowers were beginning. She thought about a kitchen in a narrow house on a cobblestone street where she had stood at a counter one ordinary Tuesday morning, stretching bread dough, flour on her forearms, no idea that the world was about to arrive at her door and turn everything she thought she knew inside out. She thought about her grandfather, the stern old man who held her hand at a funeral and seen something in a 12-year-old girl that he protected for the next 12 years, not always in the right ways, but always with intention. She thought about her parents, who she would never get to tell about this, who had named her Sophia. Wisdom, the old word meant, wisdom and clarity and knowing, as if they had understood something even before she did. And she thought about Dante, who was upstairs, still asleep in the room that was no longer just his room, but theirs, in the way that all the things that had once been his alone were becoming, slowly and irrevocably, theirs. The estate, the city, the future, the long, complicated business of learning to trust and be trusted. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, dark-haired and unhurried, with the specific, comfortable ease of a man who has, against his own predictions, arrived somewhere he wants to be. He looked at the report on the table. He looked at Sophia. "How does it look?" she asked. She looked up at him. "Like something we built." He crossed the kitchen. He poured himself coffee. He sat across from her and picked up the document and read it in the morning quiet. And Sophia watched him, the focused attention, the slight crease between his brows, the way his mouth moved fractionally when he found something worth noting, and she felt something settle in her chest with such completeness and such finality that she understood it for what it was. Not the desperate, uncertain thing that most people call love, not the performance of it, not the compromise of it, not the version built on convenience or fear or the slow erosion of better choices. This was the real version, the kind built from honesty and conflict and the difficult, patient work of knowing someone, the whole of them, the grief and the power and the capacity for gentleness hidden beneath the armor, and choosing them anyway. She had been brought to him as a transaction. She had become something he had no category for. And she, the girl who had stood in a hallway with flour on her arms and refused to be a piece on someone else's board, had discovered, in the most unlikely and violent and beautiful set of circumstances, exactly who she was. There is something that nobody tells you about inheriting a legacy. They tell you about the weight of it, the responsibility, the way it reshapes the architecture of your life around itself, demanding things of you that you never knew you had to give. But nobody tells you about the quiet moments inside the weight, the morning light in a kitchen, the warmth of a hand in a dark room, the specific, irreplaceable sensation of knowing that the person across the table, the one you came to through fire and force and a cascade of revelations that should have destroyed you, has looked at the full truth of you and stayed. Nobody tells you that the inheritance can be both the thing that was taken from you and the thing that set you free. Sophia Moretti had grown up in a small house on a cobblestone street, stretching bread dough, asking for very little, building herself out of quiet and determination and the stubborn refusal to give up. She was given away like a debt. She walked into a life she never chose, and inside that life, in the space between forced and free, between transaction and truth, between the woman she had been and the woman she was always going to become, she had found everything. The empire was hers, legitimately, undeniably hers. The city was hers, in the way that cities belong to those who know their secret histories. And the man, the cold, careful, grief-hardened, exceptionally gentle man who had walked through her door on an ordinary Tuesday morning and said, "He'll do," as if she were a variable to be solved, was hers in the only way that truly mattered. Not by force, not by strategy, not by the terms of any